Dear audience, welcome to today's fourth and last session of our discussion series, Revolution in Belarus. Over the last 2 weeks, we have discussed about social characteristics of the uprisings, of historical narratives and the use of national symbols, of the factor of Russia, that of course is decisive for what is going on in Belarus right now. And today we will dedicate this session to EU-Belarus relations. So we will have a closer look at the position the EU takes towards Belarus, the measures it has taken so far, and the room for maneuver it actually has. And of course, we want to learn what, if any, expectations the people in Belarus have towards the EU. Let me give you some technical information first. We will start with a panel discussion and then open the virtual floor for questions from the audience. And as with the previous sessions, you already have the opportunity to send us your questions through the icon F&A, Fragen und Antworten, questions and answers. So we kindly ask you to indicate your name, but in case you would rather stay anonymous, that is no problem, then we will just quote your question. Please note that this session is recorded, so it is for future download on our website. And with this, I am happy to introduce today's speakers. I will start with Sabine Fischer, political scientist, team leader of the project Public Diplomacy, EU and Russia, and Sabine is currently in Moscow. So welcome, Sabine. I'm also happy to introduce to you Janis Meliantsu. He's a political analyst and he works for the think tank Minsk Dialogue. Welcome, Janis. So, and I'm afraid that we still have some technical problems in getting through to our last but certainly not least discussant today, Dirk Schübel, EU ambassador and head of the EU delegation in Minsk. I hope that Ambassador Schübel will make it soon to join us. So, but Janis, let me start with a question to you anyway. I would really like to start this discussion with thinking from the end. I mean, among our audience are a lot of people who very closely monitor what is going on in Belarus. But still, from your perspective as an insider, and according to your analysis, which do you think are the most decisive factors that will determine the outcome of the conflict?
Good evening, everyone, once again. Thank you for inviting me to this webinar. Well, to my mind, this political crisis in Belarus is very complex, first of all. And there were a number of quite deep reasons behind the protests. And the presidential elections was just one of these. Among most decisive and most important, I would say, first of all, the absence of feedback loop in this political regime. And this is how I think Belarusian authorities lost the link between themselves and reality, for example, showing the final result of presidential elections as 90%. And this, of course, caused the outburst of protests.
Dennis, sorry if I interrupt you. Yep. I think most of the audience know what has happened so far. So my question was rather thinking about the outcome of this protest. I mean, it is hypothetical, but at least could you say which are the factors, the most decisive factors, at least from your analytical point of view, the most decisive factors that you currently see for an outcome of this current crisis, for an outcome of the political conflict we're currently facing?
Yeah, I see. Sorry for misunderstanding.
No.
Well, to my mind, there were two very important milestones for both authorities and the protesters. First of all, whether Russia would support Alexander Lukashenko and incumbent authorities or not. And Russia supported, actually, unequivocally. Putin said that Lukashenko is legitimate and that Russia is ready to even with some Siloviki staff support Belarus's order. And second important milestone was if protesters would be able to organize all nation strike or not. And as for now, we see that this intention did not succeed, actually. And the majority of workers at largest Belarusian state-owned enterprises, they did not support the strike. Some of them, of course, protested and participate now in protests and rallies. But speaking in legal terms, they did not join strike. And that's why I think that now opposition protest in general, it loses its momentum. And I think that if Belarusian authorities would act wisely, I think they will manage to appease this protest, combining different means, coercion, and some sort of dialogue, at least with some moderate participants of these protests.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for this very quick, brief outlook in the beginning. Ambassador Schübel, I think taking into account that 27 countries had to agree, the EU was quite quick in its first announcement concerning the current situation in Belarus. So what exactly was the minimum consensus the EU members have agreed upon so far?
So first of all, good evening from Minsk. From my side, finally I could make it. Sometimes
we're very happy to welcome you.
Not so easy from Minsk. Well, I don't know whether you refer to the sanctions topic or to other topics. In fact, we have agreed among each other quite well, and not only among the EU member states, but also with the UK, US, and even Switzerland and Japan. We have launched a couple of joint actions here on the spot. We had a number of local statements jointly. We have acted as early as on the 3rd of June with the first joint local statement of US, UK, and EU member states, in which we are present here in Minsk, in which we outlined our expectations to the authorities, what we expect from the presidential elections that took place more than 2 months later. Unfortunately, none of these issues has been taken up by the authorities, which is why we had to issue further statements. So you have seen the statements by the spokesperson of the HRVP, by the HRVP himself. I have to get used to the him instead of the her. And of course, we have acted also directly after the elections, condemned the violence, not accepted the election result. So this was all actually quite straightforward and easy because it was so obvious that we needed to act. So I think it was not very difficult to achieve a consensus among us member states.
Thank you. But I think it is no secret that that there are differing opinions among the member states. And if we take those countries neighboring on Belarus, like Poland and the Baltic states, I think they take a much stricter point of view regarding the EU stance towards Belarus. So could you please say, where do you see the most controversial issues with regards to Belarus inside the EU?
I think, in fact, that the crisis has brought us closer to each other. I think the differences between certain EU member states were bigger before. I think the actions by the authorities have been so obvious, so blatant, so obvious that it was not very difficult to gather. Honestly, I cannot here talk about different member states' approaches. That's we are here to unite as EU, and we are in the middle of all. So I cannot tell you country A is good and country B is bad. I think it will now be important to get our act together and to discuss the future of our relations, because obviously there will need to be changes. And I can tell you that while we are speaking today, some internal discussion took place in the...
Oh, I'm sorry. We are losing link to Ambassador Schübel. Sabine, maybe can you pick up at this point and
define our policy newly in a way? So we have to decide, how do we continue with our financial cooperation? What are we keeping? What can we not keep? How will our relations look like? And obviously, what is obvious is that the relations will not be the same as they have been until the crisis started, or until the problems started in the country.
Mm-hmm. Sabine, if you have a closer look at discussions among the EU member states, what do you think are the most controversial issues? Please unmute your mic.
Yes. Hello, and very good to see you all, and thank you for the invitation. Well, actually, I mean, first of all, I would actually agree with Dirk Schübel. I think the EU was really, I mean, also compared to other instances, the EU was actually rather quick to react. I mean, it basically made statements before the election, and it was quick to react after the election. If you look at the extraordinary meeting of the foreign ministers, and then also the extraordinary summit, I think these were very important steps on the part of the EU. And I mean, I think you already outlined the basic differences that we have. So we have, of course, the neighboring EU member states, the Baltic states, Poland, who argue for indeed stricter and more forceful reactions. And then you have other member states who that want to be, or that would prefer to be a little bit more cautious. And a lot of this discussion circles around the question of whether or not President Lukashenko should be put on the sanctions list. And then, of course, we had the controversy around the Cypriotic position today, which is linked to another foreign policy issue, which is very typical in a way for the internal discussion about EU foreign policy. And the discussion among EU member states. I mean, at this point, I don't see that as a problem yet, but indeed the EU has to get its act together and I mean, and take a decision as soon as possible if it wants to have any impact on the situation in Belarus. So I very much hope that it will be possible to overcome this problem soon. But I would again also agree with Dirk on the fact that what has been going on in Belarus and the excessive violence and also the attitude of the Belarusian president, basically refusing to interact both with the protesters, but also, for instance, with external actors apart from Russia, that tried to mediate in this situation. All this has actually brought more EU cohesion than I would, for instance, have expected before the election. So this is really, I think, an important development. And I know that there's always a lot of EU bashing also in the expert community, but I think this is something that needs to be highlighted, and that is actually a good development, even though we cannot know. And we heard Gianni's analysis of the current situation and outlook, even if we cannot know what what will happen in Belarus in the end and what will be the outcome of the developments that we see at the moment.
Thank you. Then let's briefly talk about bashing of the German government, because the opposition parties in the Bundestag have criticized the government of being, I don't know, too lenient and not really clear in their reaction. And given the fact that we have currently the German presidency of the EU, do you see, can you make out any specific German position in this setting? And what is your assessment of it? Yeah, it is to you, Sabine.
You're referring to me? Okay, I think, I mean, if you look at developments immediately after the election, I think the German presidency did what it had to do. It coordinated the EU reaction. Traditionally, indeed, Germany is on the more cautious side of, you know, in debates about particularly EU foreign policy towards the Eastern neighborhood and also Russia. And this, of course, plays a role in this discussion as well. What I think is important from a German perspective, and I'm not currently in Germany and in Berlin, so I'm seeing this, you know, as kind of an insider, outsider, I don't know. But I think what is very important is the interconnection that we now have between what is going on in Belarus and the poisoning of Alexei Navalny, which is another crisis factor where the German government obviously is very, very deeply involved. And I mean, again, this is something that actually also emanated from Belarus, if you like, because it was actually also President Lukashenko who created a specific link between the situation in Belarus and the Navalny case by hinting to intelligence and then publishing this rather infamous recording between Nick and Mike last week. So we have an interconnection between these two crises that puts a lot of pressure also on the German government and will have and does have an impact on the attitude of the German government in this situation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Thank you. Janice, we're of course eager to hear how activists, the protesters in Belarus assess the EU position. And after this first statement and also the announcement of sanctions, it was Maria Kolesnikova, I think the most prominent spokesperson in Belarus. And she said that sanctions were coming too early. She was hesitant about it. She said that though they would rather hamper the dialogue between the protesters and representatives from the administration. So was this a general view? Or do we have a broader spectrum of opinions inside Belarus when we talk about civil society and people who are linked to what we have called so far the opposition?
Well, it is very difficult to generalize because the protest is very, the protesters, they are very different and they represent different strata, different sectors of Belarusian society, and it is decentralized, and we have at least several centers that are trying to somehow influence this protest. First of all, the Coordination Council composed by the remnants of electoral staffs of different candidates. We have Mrs. Tikhanovskaya, who is in Vilnius, also trying to be a kind of a diplomatic representative of protest. We have Telegram channel Nexta, which is actually guiding the protest inside Belarus. We have different ordinary people among protesters, and I think that their opinion on what European Union is doing their opinions are different. First of all, well, of course, we do not have the sociological studies of, well, protesters and people who actually or participate in rally. But all in all, what I can see that many of them were frustrated because of very modest, to put it like this, reaction from outer world, Western world, from the United States and European Union, because as I perceive all this situation, the majority of protesters, they would like to see more active international support for Belarusian protest and revolution, let's call it like that, in general. And because of European Union, even for now, did not introduce even modest sanctions in general. This is, I think, frustrating for most of them.
Mm-hmm. Ambassador Schubel, before I will ask you to comment on this, Janice, let me come back to also money that is meant to be granted now to Belarus. Ursula von der Leyen, as president of the EU Commission, has announced that 53 million euro will be paid, 2 million for victims of repression, 1 million for support of civil society, and 50 million emergency relief to cope with Corona. And critical voices in Germany say that this is not enough, since 50 million for relief, for emergency relief due to Corona is something that would have most probably been paid anyway. So what is your position? What do you think about the EU's policy so far? Sorry, this is to Janice first, yeah.
Well, I'm not in the position to define or to somehow suggest any recommendations to the European Union. But I think that it is very important for Brussels and the different European capitals to think over what European Union actually wants from Belarus, and what should be the strategy and the final goals for the European Union. Either European Union would like to see Belarus under Russian occupation, or as an independent European state, or as a part of European Union. Is European Union does European Union want to revolution in Belarus? And I think if European Union would have such answers and such set of goals, it will be quite easy to adjust toolboxes of its policy and influence the situation in the country. Because I think as for now, it is very difficult for me to find any to see any possibilities for European Union to influence the real politics inside Belarus, because Alexander Lukashenko made his decision, and he referred to Mr. Putin and appealed to Mr. Putin for help. And it is, of course, absolutely obvious that such type of sanctions that European Union is preparing will be absolutely useless to influence Belarusian authorities and make them to discuss political transition and transition of power from incumbent political regime to opposition, whatever opposition we can see in Belarus. And of course, if European Union would like to change political situation dramatically in Belarus, it should different other options should be used, like strict economic sanctions or military intervention, or some discussion with Russia, but not personal sanctions, definitely.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
Okay, thank you. I think we will talk about the Russian factor once again, but Ambassador Schubel first, I mean, as I already said, the EU was quite quick in its first official announcement, and so. But what is the room of maneuver, and what is the EU strategy beyond, let's say, beyond sanctions or beyond granting money? Could you please elaborate on that?
Well, the first thing to say is that Belarus is not Ukraine, it is not Moldova, it is not Georgia. We have a totally different situation in Belarus. We have a domestic conflict, a purely domestic original conflict in which the people are opposing the one and only leader of the country. And this is why they have taken to the streets, because they felt betrayed. Their votes got stolen, and afterwards they were beaten up for having taken to the streets for exercising their right. So we have always said, and we continue to say it, that we remain completely out of this conflict. What we want is that human rights and democracy is respected in Belarus, and that has not been the case. So we are supporting free and fair elections, which have not taken place. We have not seen free and fair elections. We have seen the opposite of free and fair elections. We have seen massive falsifications. And this is what we have clearly mentioned on all the meetings that have taken place in August. By the way, it's not so easy to get all foreign ministers on board and all heads of state on board in the middle.
Yeah. So, I'm afraid Ambassador Schübel is lost once again, but I hope he will join us again soon.
I was stuck.
Ah.
Now I'm there again, but if you want to, I don't know until what point you heard me.
Yeah, well, we didn't get what you please just repeat the last few sentences, because
Yes, I was simply saying that the simple thing we want is that democracy and human rights are respected in the country, which has not been the case, and that the people's will of having free and fair elections is respected by some new elections in which can be held under OSCE observation, everything as it has to be done, and then whoever may be the winner should be the winner. And if Mr. Lukashenko wins free and fair elections, it is difficult to imagine at this moment, but then I think that is fair enough. But what we have been doing is to call exactly for this, and that is why we have been supporting also institutions or bodies like the Coordination Council, because we believe that they have exactly asked and raised this question. And that's why we are all very sad to see the situation that basically all but one board member of the Coordination Council is now either in jail or abroad. And by the way, I just came from a joint meeting of all EU ambassadors present in Minsk to Svetlana Alexievich. We were yesterday already, a couple of us were there, and today we were all together to express our solidarity, with the Nobel Prize winner Svetlana Alexievich, but also to her personally, and as a substitute for all members.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So my next question to Ambassador Schübel would have been Ambassador Schübel. Can you hear me now? Okay, I'm sorry. We will come back to Ambassador Schübel, but Sabine, maybe to you. Who do you think are the main addressees now of EU politics, given the fact, as Ambassador Schübel has just said, that it is really difficult, since most people of the coordinating committee have been either deported or are in jail now. So who are the main addressees of the politics? And Ambassador Schübel, I would be then happy if you could comment on that as well. But Sabine first.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think that the main addressees remain the main addressees that the EU policy had before the if you like, elimination of the leadership or the leading level of the coordination council. So, I mean, it's Belarusian society. I think the EU needs to give very strong signals of support to Belarusian society. And that includes, of course, statements. It includes support for those who are now being repressed, you know, like very prominent figures like Maria Kalyasnikova, but indeed also other protesters who are in jail. So the EU needs to build up and maintain pressure in order to, or to contribute to this situation improving. And the addressees, in a more negative way, if you like, are also, I mean, they're basically the authorities in Minsk and the authorities in Russia, obviously, because Russia is a key player in this context. So, and I would like to perhaps comment very briefly on what Janice said about the uselessness of EU sanctions. I mean, in principle, I agree. Personal targeted sanctions, they are not the lever that will indeed substantially change the situation in Belarus. I think that is perfectly obvious for anyone. But I don't see, I mean, at the moment, okay, economic, and I will say something about that a little bit later. Economic sanctions, yes, they would help. I think the EU also needs to consider, and will consider, I'm sure, its cooperation with Belarus in the framework of the Eastern Partnership. In my view, like at the official level, at the state level, this can not go ahead. So there needs to be a broader approach towards this. But at the same time, I think we should be very clear that this kind of EU action, even if it is broadened, even if it is stronger, will really change the situation in Belarus. And this has a lot to do with the fact that after some hesitation, Russia has indeed, as you said, Janice, thrown its weight behind Belarus. And this is, or behind Lukashenko, sorry, and the Belarusian regime. And this is something that, I'm sorry, but EU policy cannot change that. And this is why I think that Russia, that Moscow is another very important addressee of EU policy. So engaging with Russia on the situation in Belarus, of course, but also making it very clear to Russia that if there is stronger involvement or even covert or open intervention in whatever way, that this also will have consequences for Russia.
Thank you, Sabine. Since you have already mentioned Russia, unfortunately, I think we can't discuss the current situation in Belarus without talking about Russia. And so, Ambassador Schübel, my question to you. Critical voices in Germany say that the EU should have sent a clear message to Russia right from the beginning, that interventions in Belarus will have consequences for EU-Russia relations. So how does the EU Commission assess the Russian factor? And what is the EU's approach towards Russia in this situation? Ambassador Schübel, did you get my question? Ambassador Schübel? Please unmute your microphone.
Yes, I was saying, I'm sorry, but I'm constantly on and off here. I'm hearing half of what you say, but I understood your question.
Okay, so could you please comment on
as long as I'm not disappearing, so I will continue talking. So okay. Russia is, of course, the #1 factor. I think there are two factors in that will define the crisis in Belarus. One is the people. That means it takes. It depends on how long people will take in masses to the streets. I personally think next Sunday we will see the biggest demonstration ever, because, and I don't agree with Dennis on that point, because what they have done this week by putting very popular figures into jail with Maria Kalyasnikova and attacking also Svetlana Alexievich, this will have consequences which will not go idly by. So we will see probably bigger demonstrations. Second factor is Russia. And Russia is, of course, the external decisive factor. We will see what the meeting of Mr. Lukashenko in Moscow on Monday will bring with President Putin. Rumors say that the Union Treaty will be advanced. We do not have any concrete information. We will see what is the outcome. Obviously, they will. I would tend to think that Mr. Putin will try to convince Mr. Lukashenko of tackling the so-called 31st chapter on the institutions. We will know how far they will go at the latest on Monday or Tuesday. It will be, in principle, Mr. Lukashenko is now in such a position that he depends fully on Mr. Putin's goodwill. And we will have to see how much Mr. Putin and Russia as such is willing to back Mr. Lukashenko, or whether they have any alternative in the sleeve that they would like to see in power, perhaps also after the official period of the old president has lapsed, which will be on the 5th of November. You might have noticed there has been no inauguration yet of Mr. Lukashenko, which usually has happened in past presidential elections very quickly after the elections. So it is obvious that there is a problem. So obviously what we should have done, I think we have been very clear that we asked for non-interference in Belarus domestic affairs. And while Russia is doing the same on officially, we see journalists of RT taking over the state channels in Belarus. And if you see the propaganda, it's now exactly streamlined. We have the same messages passed on by the Belarusian state TV that we have heard for many years already from Moscow. So that is very much streamlined. I don't want to mention even the 33 Wagner Group people who disappeared very quietly back into Russia, although they were declared before as the biggest enemy of the country by Mr. Lukashenko himself and by others. So all of this, many visits have taken place of Russian politicians. Prime Minister Mishustin was in town with a whole range of ministers and deputy prime ministers. There are probably even some other visits about which we don't know. So I think there's a lot ongoing, and it will all depend on Russia basically on how Mr. Lukashenko's personal situation is likely to develop.
But do you see that there is an opportunity for the EU to send a clear message to Russia?
I think we have sent clear messages, and of course we are not in the best of relationships these days with Russia. And this is not only concerning Navalny, it's not only concerning Germany, it is concerning the whole EU and even more NATO and the world community, of course, what has happened there. We have also done some analysis of our EU-Russia relations in Gimlich, as you will know. And in principle, we try to see where we can move on Russia relations, but of course the latest events do not give any hope that the relations will improve considerably in the near future.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes, Janice and Sabine, please feel free to comment on this. And of course, if you want to comment also briefly again on Navalny and to what extent you see this link to what is going on in Belarus right now, just feel free to do so. Sabine.
Yeah, I'll leave the Navalny question to Janice because I have already commented on it. But I wanted to just say a few words about Russia's motives, because I think we mustn't forget that Russia's support for Lukashenko it's not unconditional. On the contrary, I think Russia has two main goals. This is basically keeping control in Belarus in all areas, political, economic, security, and preventing a democratic revolution from happening. These are the two goals. And as long as Lukashenko as a person, as the president that Russia has recognized, can guarantee that, he will have Russia's support. But if Moscow gets the impression that Lukashenko is no longer the guarantee of these two Russian goals, then this will change. And here is where in my view, the protests come in again, because if the protests continue, then, the Russian perspective might change. If the protests continue, there may be movements in the Belarusian state apparatus, depending on how this development goes, which again may have an impact on the Russian perspective. So we have seen a development clearly in the Russian position over the past 4 weeks. So from hesitation and an observing attitude to a consolidation behind the Belarusian regime, but this is not finite. I think this can change again. So a lot still depends on the developments in Belarus with a view to Russia's position.
Thank you. Jens, what is your view on the Russian factor?
Well, I think that actually we have two different realities. One reality was actual just during the first week of protests when Lukashenko was about to lose his power, and he was desperate, and he called Mr. Putin, and Putin recognized Lukashenko as a legitimate and offered him a help. And now we have quite a different situation. Now Belarusian authorities, Lukashenko consolidates his, power. We now passed these several milestones I mentioned before. A strike, overall all Belarusian strike, and second, Russia support, and third, also the consolidation of regime, because for now, none of significant, participants of Belarusian regime and Lukashenko's team actually come to a revolutionary side or protester side. And this system proved its quite resilience. And now Lukashenko, I think he understands that he actually has a possibility to contain Russia's influence. And now he has different negotiations positions vis-a-vis Putin compared to the first 1 or 2 weeks after the presidential elections. And I wouldn't exaggerate now the Russia's influence on Lukashenko, and I think while and in parallel, if the political protests and rallies will be again less and less populous, and Lukashenko more and more consolidates his regime, I think the things between Belarus and Russia will become more and more business as usual. And if you listen to Lukashenko's interview to Russia's journalists yesterday's, I believe it was 2 days before, Lukashenko said a very important to my mind sentence word that first, before signing any other deeper integration agreements with Russia, we first have to implement what was already signed. And this is a clear message, at least to me, that Lukashenko feels his strength now vis-a-vis Russia. And this is not Lukashenko hours after the elections. This is different Lukashenko. And when it comes to Russia's motives in Belarus, I agree with Sabine that, first of all, Russia does not have decent infrastructure, political infrastructure in Belarus. There is no single pro-Russian party. There is no pro-Russian majority of population in Belarus. Of course, many Belarusians would like to integrate with Russia economically, but not politically. There are plenty of sociological data that proves this argument. I think that Kremlin understands this perfectly. And first of all, they made a stake on Lukashenko and preserving him in power. But what Russia is needed, Russia actually needs weakened Lukashenko in order to promote its own interest in Belarus. And while and when Russia will have such infrastructure of influence in Belarus, let's say a couple of political parties, a decentralized Belarusian political system after the constitutional reform, I think it will behave differently. And now it needs a year or two to establish such infrastructure. And that's why Russia supported Lukashenko personally. And Russia also supported the idea of constitutional reform, because this idea is pronounced now by President Lukashenko. The idea is to decentralize Belarusian authoritarian, very vertical political system. And once decentralized, political system is vulnerable for different political influence by Russia, by other players. And what is actually they needs now from Belarus, to my mind.
Okay. Thank you. So we have talked about Russia. Let's talk about the US and take the first question from the audience. Martin Mann says, it was mentioned that Japan and the US supported the EU's position. And now his question, are the US likely to simply back the position of the EU on this case all along the way? Or will they rather develop their own strategy, rather independent, or exceeding that of the EU's? Sabine and Janis, what is your hypothesis? If any.
Ladies first.
Sabine, please unmute your mic.
Okay, yes, thank you. Thank you for the question. I think there is no clearly formulated US policy at the, I mean, there have been statements of support, of course, I think from Congress and other actors. I think the position of the White House was less clearly defined, and this is a general problem that we have with US policy at the moment. So I wouldn't, I have doubts that the US is going to unequivocally support the EU's position. I mean, the US as a unitary actor, because this kind of foreign policy actor, or the US is not this kind of foreign policy actor at the moment, particularly because the US is in the election phase, as we all know. So this is going to be very difficult. I think the EU will be more or less on its own when it comes to Belarus. Also because Belarus is not very high on the US foreign policy agenda. So I have my doubts that there will be very strong US support for the EU's position during the election campaign.
Mm-hmm. Janis, do you have anything to comment, or do you have any position on this?
I think that United States position is now just under elaboration, and there is also clear differences between State Department position and White House position on that. And State Department pushes the idea of returning US ambassador as far as possible to Belarus in order to have the voice, first of all, of United States in Minsk, and the second to have the first-hand information from the field. And I think that the position of the of Washington position is much more geopolitical than the European Union one, and we can just recall here the so-called West-Mitchell approach and strategy toward the Eastern Central Europe, when Belarus appeared first in the history of bilateral relations as a part of anti-Russian front. And it was quite surprising and interesting. And now United States might see Belarus also as a part of so new Cold War between Russia and the West, and that's why the geopolitical terms and geopolitical factors arguments are much more important for Washington compared to Brussels. Yes, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. I mean, so we've talked about Russia, we've talked about the US. Let's talk about other multilateral bodies, multilateral organizations. Sabine, we have the EU, but we also have the OSCE. We might even talk about the Venice Commission of the European Council. At least Belarus is associated to the European Council. could you say, Sabine, could you say, where do you see the job of the EU, so to say, and where do you see should OSCE come in, or the Venice Commission?
Well, in an ideal world, or in the ideal case, I think the OSCE would come in and would be the ideal player, actually, and the ideal supporting organization if, you know, there was an internal negotiation in the form of a roundtable between the authorities and the demonstrators. If there was an agreement on early on new elections that could then be executed with the support of the OSCE and of the Venice Commission, I mean, there would be procedures to be elaborated. There would be elections that would need to be monitored. So these would all be very, very important functions that the OSCE could take over. So far, unfortunately, this is not happening, mainly because, I mean, there have been discussions within the OSCE, but unfortunately neither Russia nor Belarus are ready to actually allow for the OSCE to take that function.
Okay, thank you. Janice, I would also like you to briefly comment, but I also have a question to you from the audience, from Anastasia Lysina. She asked, could you please comment on Lukashenko's interview to Russian journalists and what was his main message? So if you could briefly, again, elaborate on the interview that you have already mentioned.
Well, the main message was that Belarus is actually on Russia's side, that all what happened during the so-called revolution was inspired by the West and coordinated by the West. So this is clearly this message that was conveyed during the first week of protest from Lukashenko towards Putin, that this is the West behind all destabilization moves, either against Belarus or against Russia. And he also hinted that Belarus was a kind of testing waters, testing ground for Western technologies, what could be used and will be used against Russia in 2025 or 24, when Mr. Putin will go through the presidential elections. And again, this message, the main goal of this message, showing that Belarus is the ally of Russia, the ultimate, perhaps the last truly ally of Russia, and this is the goal also to get Russia's support. But the second message was that well, actually Belarus remained the independent state, and once Russia would like to incorporate Belarus, Belarus would, well, again, resist. It wasn't pronounced very bluntly, but it was, again, behind what Lukashenko said about Belarusian interests and further integration, as I mentioned. Well, on the one hand, Lukashenko tried to say to Russian audience that he is on Russia's side, and the second part of this message is that Belarus is an independent state, Lukashenko consolidating his power, and we, as Belarus and the authorities, we survived this crisis, and we will negotiate with Russia on the from the equal positions, not as subordinate or just begging for help.
Thank you. Sabine. Sabine, I will also you may comment on this, but I also have one question, because I would, of course, like to come back to the EU at the end of our discussion. And in several statements that you've made over the last weeks, you have called for the EU to generate international pressure. So what exactly do you mean by this? How could this work? But please comment on Lukashenko's interview or what Janis has just said.
Okay, I will do that. Gabi, there are more questions in the chat, not in the Q&A, but in the chat. So just to prevent them from getting lost. Yeah, international pressure. I mean, this concerns obviously media attention. So I think the level of media attention in EU member states has been very impressive over the past 4 weeks. And this is something that needs to be held up. Of course, held up. I mean, the EU needs to keep up its own observation and needs to keep up statements, etc., against the violation of human rights, against the detention, deportation of opposition politicians, etc. So this international attention, the international discussion about Belarus needs to keep going. I think this is very important. It should also be transported into other international institutions such as the UN, such as the OSCE. So it's very important to keep up this level of international attention, because it does generate political pressure. And I think the EU needs to be among the actors that do not allow Belarus and what is going on in Belarus currently to basically disappear from the screen. I think this would be really catastrophic and would have very serious implications also internally. Let me just make one comment on this interview, and Janis, I would just like to briefly react to your interpretation. I mean, I watched this interview with fascination, and I agree with you. I think Lukashenko, I mean, we must not forget that the 4 people who were sitting opposite of him yesterday were representatives of Russian state media. So this interview also had a very important function from a Russian point of view. And indeed, he was trying to make a point. And indeed, this point was, I remain the president of Belarus, and Belarus remains an independent and sovereign state under my control. The problem is that, I mean, Belarusian policy over the past 10, 15 years always lived off playing Russia and the EU off against each other. And I think this will not be possible from now. And I think it is really for the EU to make sure that this is no longer possible. So here again, I think EU policy has a very important function. Plus, I think that with the current situation, Belarus will probably be in very difficult economic conditions also, because this crisis will have an economic impact, which will increase dependence on Russia again. So I think, I mean, to my mind, this interview was more an expression of a desire than a reflection of reality, of the reality of Belarusian-Russian relations. I mean, we'll see how it plays out in the end, but this would be my interpretation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So we take the last questions, and one is from Diana Veras. Do you see any instruments Germany can use to push Russia to start dialogue between protest movements and Lukashenko? Are there any solution without Russia possible? Is there any solution without Russia possible? So this is one question. And the other one from Mirko Krupa is I mean, he just says, no matter the outcome of the current crisis, isn't it likely that discussions inside the Belarusian Republic and inside the society about political reforms goals will continue? And the EU will then only be able to watch further developments. I mean, how do you assess this? Sabine, would you like to start?
Yeah, very briefly. A solution without Russia, no, I don't think it's possible, which makes me rather pessimistic when it comes to finding a solution, because I think really the main Russian motives are preventing a democratic revolution in Belarus from happening and keeping control of the country. So I'm rather pessimistic here. I think the only instrument that the EU now have also vis-a-vis Russia is pressure. So political pressure, but also, and I mean, this is where again, Navalny and the Navalny case in Belarus come together, probably also sanctions. So I think all this, like these two crises taken together, will have a very, very serious impact on EU-Russia relations, on the relations between Germany and Russia. And on Milko's question, I absolutely agree with this. I mean, I think we should see these protests as part of a structural development. It's not the first protest that we see in Belarus. It's not these protests are not triggered by new problems. So they are triggered by the problems, the internal dysfunction of an aging autocracy, if you like, or this dictatorship that will probably face serious economic problems in the months and perhaps years to come. So I think this it's part of a process, and indeed I think that this discussion is not at an end. It is ongoing, and and it will have an impact. I mean, if we think about scenarios, to my mind, and I will be interested in hearing what Zanis has to say about this. To my mind, Lukashenko will either fall now or stay on for a longer period of time. So these are the two scenarios that I think are more or less realistic in the current moment, because I think the situation is very open. And if he stays on, then indeed we will see more protests in the future on economic issues, on social equality, etc., etc.
Thank you. Janice, your last comment, please, for this discussion.
Well, as for now, I do not see any possibility for European Union to influence the situation. Russia is a kingmaker, and I think just before presidential campaign, the EU actually had potential to influence, but it lost it by introducing and saying about introduction of sanctions. And that's why I think Alexander Lukashenko had no other option to go to Putin for help. And as I wrote more than 10 years ago in one of article, again, about European Union sanctions against Belarusian authorities, that the main sanction and the main possible successful sanction is intensified cooperation with Belarusian authorities. And through dragging Belarusian state in general into European orbit via different programs, educational, economic, signing basic cooperation agreement, and so on and so forth, European Union could achieve more influence in Belarus, and showing, alienating, and discussing about sanctions. I think this will be counterproductive and prove that Lukashenko actually was right. Then European Union and the West in general had a knife behind its back, talking to Lukashenko. And I think that it is a question if European Union could influence all this situation while talking with Putin, and by talking with Mr. Putin. I have doubts about that, because Russia has very definite interests in Belarus, and Russia sees also Belarus as its canonic territory, preferential interest territory. And I don't think that Russia will allow any moves from the side of the West in order to influence, for larger influence, to gain larger influence in Belarus. Mm-hmm. So I'm pessimistic all in all about all this situation, and I don't think that the situation will be better for ordinary people. Either Lukashenko stays in power or revolution will win because of economic situation again and very complicated relations with Russia. Well, but let's see.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the economic situation would probably be then the topic for further session. Let me end by just reading out one last question. I will not ask you to answer it. The question was by Nico Butilin, and he says, Lithuania became the first state recognizing Tsikhanouskaya as the national elected leader and called Lukashenko an illegitimate leader. Therefore, any cross-border treaties will not be recognized. Can we expect more countries to follow? And is this a good sign for the protest movement? I will not ask you to answer this, but this fits in well with what would have been my last question to Ambassador Dirk Schübel, who unfortunately had to leave us for technical reasons. And this is that the term of President Lukashenko, I think, will end in early October. And as we've already heard, there has not been an inauguration yet. Since the EU has not recognized the elections, it will be really interesting to hear who will be the new contact person, who will be the official spokesperson for the EU to talk to after the term of Lukashenko ends. But this is something that we will not get an answer to now. So let me thank our three discussants. Thanks to Dirk Schübel, who unfortunately already had to leave this session. Thanks to Sabine Fischer from Moscow, and thanks a lot also to Janis Milianțu from Belarus. And with this, we end this four-part discussion series on Belarus, but of course DGO will still monitor and will have further on a closer look at what's going on in Belarus. So please have a look at our publications and further events. Thank you very much and have a nice evening.
Thank you.
Thank you
Goodbye.
very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.